The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalk. The air was thick with the heat of the late afternoon, but for Malik, it was the least of his worries. With every step, his cane tapped against the ground with a rhythm of its own, steady, measured, and almost like a warning. He didn't need to look behind him to feel the eyes. He never did. They followed him wherever he went, always judging, always watching. Today, the weight of it all felt heavier than usual. The world seemed to press in around him, its edges blurred by the harsh reality of what it was to be him. A black teenager with a disability. There was no hiding it. His limp was obvious, his skin a target. He had long stopped expecting kindness from the world, but sometimes, just sometimes, he dared to hope for a moment of peace. As he moved through the streets of the city, the buzzing of a distant siren cut through the quiet. Malik's grip tightened on his cane. The sound was familiar now, too familiar, and his heart skipped a beat, knowing it wasn't a coincidence. They were coming for him again. They always did. His eyes darted to the side as two police cars came into view, their engines roaring to a halt in the street ahead of him. The officers in uniform stepped out, their eyes scanning the area before locking onto Malik. A cold shiver ran down his spine. "Hey!" one of them called out. His voice was sharp, commanding. Malik froze for a moment, uncertainty flooding his veins. What now? He hadn't done anything, but that never mattered, did it? Not to them. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with the underlying fear he couldn't shake. "We need to check you," the officer said, his eyes narrowing. "You look suspicious." Malik felt a sickening twist in his gut. Suspicious? He hadn't even looked at anyone wrong. He hadn't even looked at them at all. Without another word, the officer reached for Malik, his hands grabbing at his arms with an invasive force that made Malik stumble. His cane clattered to the ground, forgotten in the struggle. He winced as the officer yanked him backward, pressing him against the cold metal of one of the squad cars. "Stand still!" the officer barked, his breath hot against Malik's ear. "We'll get this over quick." "Please, I'm not doing anything," Malik tried to protest, but the words felt weak, pointless as they slipped from his lips. His heart raced, his mind spinning with the all-too-familiar sense of helplessness. Then, as the officer moved to search him more thoroughly, something shifted. Malik felt the subtle tug around his neck. At first, he barely noticed it, but then the officer's eyes flicked down, narrowing with confusion. "What's this?" the officer muttered, his fingers brushing the leather strap that was tied loosely around Malik's neck. It wasn't just any strap. It was a leash, a dog's leash. The officer's face darkened. "What the hell is this doing on you?" His voice dropped, cold and calculating now, as if something dangerous was lurking behind the words. Malik's breath caught in his throat. His heart hammered so loud it drowned out everything else. The leash. The damn leash. But it wasn't his. He didn't know how it had ended up there, how it had been tied to him. His mind spun as he tried to make sense of it. He wanted to scream, to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. And then, the officer's radio crackled, breaking the silence between them. "Federal unit requesting backup," the voice crackled. "K9 unit on standby. Is the suspect secured?" Malik's blood ran cold. The officer looked back at him, his expression darkening. "You're in a lot of trouble, kid." Everything felt as though it had shifted in that instant, as if the world had tilted sideways. What had started as a routine encounter was now spiraling into something far more dangerous, far more complicated than Malik had ever anticipated. His mind raced. Why was the leash there? What was this K9 unit? And why did they need to get involved? What did they want with him? Malik's thoughts were interrupted by another officer, one who had just appeared beside the first. "Get the dog out here," he ordered, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Let's see what he's hiding." As the sound of heavy boots approached, Malik could feel his stomach turn. Something was wrong, far more wrong than he could ever have imagined. Malik's breath caught in his throat as the officer's words echoed in his ears, each syllable laced with the sharp edge of danger. "Get the dog out here." He didn't understand. He didn't want to understand. His body was stiff, locked in place by a combination of fear and the bone-deep certainty that something far darker was unfolding. The second officer, a tall man with a crew cut, moved briskly to the squad car and opened the door with a sharp squeal. Malik's eyes flicked toward the motion, and his stomach twisted in knots. He couldn't see the dog yet, but he could hear its growl, a low, guttural noise that sent a fresh wave of terror through his veins. He knew, instinctively, that it wasn't just any dog. The sound it made was primal, controlled, and menacing. It was trained for something far worse than a simple search. "Keep him still," the first officer ordered, his grip tightening on Malik's arm as if he intended to break it. His voice was thick with contempt, but Malik could see the slight glimmer of amusement in the officer's eyes as he looked at him. It was the kind of gaze that felt as though it had seen this before. Countless times, perhaps. Malik's heart hammered, each beat a painful reminder of the skin he was trapped in. He was black, and that was all that mattered. Every time he moved, every time he breathed, there was an unspoken narrative that followed him like a shadow. He was dangerous. He was a threat. The officers didn't see him for who he was. They saw a target. They saw someone to be contained, subdued, punished. The officer holding him roughly twisted his wrist behind his back, forcing Malik to bend forward as he struggled to breathe through the pain. "Hold still," the officer snapped, the harshness in his voice a stark contrast to the eerie calmness of the second officer, who now stood by the open door of the squad car, waiting for the K9 to emerge. The leash tightened around Malik's neck, the leather pressing against his skin, and for a moment, it felt like the air had thickened to the point where he couldn't get enough of it. Every breath came in short, desperate gasps. He couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stand there, frozen, his mind racing with thoughts that made no sense. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. But where could he run? What could he do when the very ground beneath his feet was made of their hate? The dog finally emerged, its massive form sliding from the back seat with practiced ease. It was a German shepherd, its eyes wild and alert, its muscles rippling beneath its thick coat of fur. The officers spoke to it in low, guttural commands, and Malik felt his chest tighten further as it stalked toward him, its eyes locking onto him with a terrifying focus. The second officer, the one with the crew cut, looked Malik up and down, a cruel smirk on his face. "You look like you've got something to hide. You're just another one of them, huh?" He sneered. The venom in his words dripped like poison, just like the rest of your kind, causing trouble wherever you go. You people don't know your place. Malik felt the sting of the words like a slap. It wasn't new. It wasn't the first time he'd heard them. But this time, the words cut deeper. This time, there was a weight to them that felt suffocating. The officer wasn't just talking about his skin, but about his very existence. His presence on this earth was a problem for them, something that needed to be erased or controlled. The dog stepped forward, its hot breath against Malik's leg as it sniffed him, its powerful nose pushing against his jeans. The officer who was holding him let go of his arm for a brief moment, the grip loosening just enough for Malik to feel a flicker of hope, a fleeting moment where he might be able to escape. But then, the officer's hand shot out, grabbing his collar with a vicious yank. "Where do you think you're going, huh?" the officer growled. His fingers dug into Malik's skin, bruising him, twisting the fabric of his shirt like it was a rag. "I told you to stand still!" Malik winced, trying to pull away, but it was futile. The officer's strength was overwhelming, and Malik was trapped. The dog circled him, its growls rising in pitch as it began to bark, its teeth flashing in the harsh light of the street lamp. Malik could feel the tension in the air, the electricity that crackled between him and the officers. It wasn't just a dog search anymore. It wasn't just a random stop. This had turned into something else. A show of power. A demonstration of control. "You know," the officer with the crew cut said, his voice dripping with mockery, "this could all go a lot easier for you if you just cooperated. But I guess you don't know how to do that, do you? You people never do." Malik's heart slammed in his chest. The words cut deeper than any blade. It wasn't just the casual racism. It was the way they treated him as less than human. The way his very presence seemed to provoke them, make them angry. He wasn't just being searched. He was being dehumanized. And then, As if to punctuate the officer's cruel words, the dog lunged forward, snapping its jaws close to Malik's leg. He jumped back in panic, his heart racing as the animal's teeth missed him by inches. The officers laughed. The second officer, standing off to the side, shook his head. "Get the leash tight. We don't want him running off, do we?" The first officer grinned, his hands rough as they tightened the leash around Malik's neck. "You're lucky we're even giving you a chance. A little tug from this dog, and you won't be running anywhere. You understand?" Malik's breath caught. His body went rigid. He couldn't breathe. The leash pulled tighter, digging into his skin, cutting off the air he desperately needed. The dog barked, its powerful jaws snapping again. Malik's vision blurred, the edges of his sight fading as the pressure around his throat grew unbearable. His chest heaved, but he couldn't get enough air. He couldn't think. He was drowning. Then, in a split second, the officer released the leash, and Malik collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His hand clutched his throat, trying to steady himself. The officers stood over him, their expressions unreadable, but there was something in their eyes, something cold, something that said this wasn't over. "You should be grateful, kid," the first officer said, his voice laced with contempt. "This is nothing compared to what could happen to you. You're lucky we're even letting you breathe." Malik looked up at them, his vision swimming. He wanted to say something, to fight back, to scream that this wasn't right. But his voice was lost. His throat was raw. He felt broken, stripped of everything that made him who he was. They had taken his dignity, his breath, and now they had him on the ground, at their mercy. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they didn't even care. The officers began to move away, their voices fading into the night. The dog, still circling Malik, finally stopped barking and stood beside its handler, panting as it watched him warily. Malik didn't move. He couldn't. He felt like a shell of himself, just a body left behind in the wake of their cruelty. But even in the depths of his humiliation, something sparked inside of him. He wasn't going to let this be the end. Not this time. He would rise. He would fight back. No matter how many times they tried to break him, he would keep standing. The night fell heavy and thick around Malik as the last remnants of the officer's laughter echoed in his ears. He remained on the ground, still gasping for air, his body trembling with a mix of pain, humiliation, and fear. His mind refused to focus, but one thing stood out clearer than anything else: the leash. The cruel, inexplicable leash. It had been wrapped around his neck like an anchor, pulling him down, choking him. Every part of him was broken in that moment, but more than the physical pain, it was the weight of the humiliation that crushed him. The dog was gone now, the officers no longer lingering to revel in his suffering. They had done what they set out to do: assert their power, humiliate him, make him feel small, less than. The world had turned its back on him once again, like it always did. He slowly pushed himself up, his arms trembling as they found purchase on the cold pavement. His vision was blurry, his body aching from the brutal treatment. Malik wiped at his face, feeling the sting of the dirt and sweat that had mixed with the tears he hadn't realized were falling. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was everything. Everything. He had been reduced to an animal, treated like nothing more than a criminal because of the color of his skin. The leash around his neck wasn't just a symbol of control. It was a reflection of the chains society had placed around him from the moment he was born. With shaky hands, he touched the collar on his neck. The leather was rough, unfamiliar, and it felt like it belonged to someone else. Who had tied it there, he wondered. Why was it there? There were too many questions swirling in his mind, but one thing was for certain. It wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just about a routine stop or a misunderstanding. He stood up, swaying as his body tried to regain its equilibrium. The streets were empty now, the officers long gone, but the sting of their words, their eyes, stayed with him. He had to keep moving, though. There was no choice. No matter how broken he felt, he couldn't let himself stay here, curled on the asphalt. He had to keep moving. He had to survive. That was the only thing he had control over anymore. His mind wandered back to the few moments he had with his mother before everything had spiraled out of control. He had never been able to shake the memory of her warning him about the world. "Be careful, baby," she would say, her voice low, her eyes filled with a weariness Malik had never fully understood. "This world ain't made for people like us. It's made to break you. It'll try to tear you apart. But you gotta stand. You gotta keep standing." But how? How was he supposed to stand when the world was so intent on pushing him down, on reminding him of his place in this system that saw him as nothing more than a threat? The further Malik walked, the more the ache in his chest grew. He could feel the heaviness of the leash still hanging around his neck, like a constant reminder of what he had just endured. It wasn't just the officers, it was everyone. The looks, the whispers, the side eyes. He had been born into a cage of prejudice, and every step he took seemed to lead him further into its confines. He turned down a narrow alley, his steps slow, his heart heavy with thoughts he didn't want to think. Every footfall seemed to echo in the stillness of the city. The weight of what had just happened lingered in his bones, but something else was growing inside of him too. A quiet anger, a burning rage at the injustice of it all. He didn't know where it was going to go or how it would manifest, but he knew one thing for certain. It was there, and it was real. As Malik rounded the corner, he saw a flicker of light from the corner of his eye. It was a neon sign, buzzing faintly, casting an eerie glow across the alley. The words, "Open 24 hours, blinked in red, and something about it felt like an invitation, an escape. Without thinking, he headed toward the light. The door to the small corner store opened with a creak as Malik stepped inside. The place was small, cramped, and cluttered with dusty shelves filled with snacks and canned goods. The air inside was thick with the smell of old tobacco and cheap cologne. Behind the counter, an older man stood, his expression unreadable as he looked up from the newspaper he was reading. He barely glanced at Malik, but his eyes lingered a bit longer than normal. "Can I help you?" the man asked, in a voice that was gruff but not unfriendly. Malik nodded, his throat still tight. He wasn't sure what he was doing here. He didn't need anything from the store. He didn't even want to be here. But it felt like the only place he could go. I just need a drink," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded and motioned toward the small refrigerator in the corner. Malik made his way over, his mind spinning as he stared at the rows of drinks. But none of them seemed to matter. None of them could ease the storm in his chest. As he reached for a bottle of water, he noticed something in the reflection of the refrigerator door, something moving just outside the window. His heart skipped a beat, and his hand froze. For a moment, he thought he was imagining things. But then the figure moved closer, and Malik's breath caught in his throat. It was another officer, the same officer who had humiliated him earlier. Malik quickly turned away, his pulse racing. He didn't want to make eye contact, didn't want to draw attention to himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the officer had seen him, that he knew exactly where Malik was. For a moment, everything in Malik's world seemed to stop. His mind was racing, his body locked in place. He was trapped again. Trapped in a city that saw him as a threat, as something less than human. The weight of the leash still felt tight around his neck, even though it wasn't there anymore. The officer's footsteps grew louder as he approached the store. Malik's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let them find him again. Not after everything that had just happened. He had to get out. The door to the store opened with a sharp jingle, and Malik didn't hesitate. He bolted, his legs carrying him out the door and into the night before the officer could even step inside. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted down the alley, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what he was running from or to. He just knew that he couldn't stop. He had to keep running, and then, as if in slow motion, everything changed again. There was a sharp crack, a flash of pain, and Malik collapsed to the ground. His body went numb. The world around him spun, and everything seemed to blur. He didn't even know when it happened. All he knew was that this time he might not make it. Before we continue with Malik's journey, let's take a brief pause. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you experienced anything similar in your own life? Or do you have thoughts you'd like to share? Your feedback means a lot to us, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter. Now, let's get back to Malik's story. The city had become a maze, a twisted labyrinth where every corner, every alleyway, held the same suffocating weight of injustice. Malik's mind raced as his body staggered forward, each step heavy, each breath shallow. He could still feel the sting of the officer's cruel laugh echoing in his head. Still hear the bark of the dog, still see the leash wrapped around his neck like a symbol of everything that was wrong with this world. He stumbled down the sidewalk, his heart pounding as though it might break free from his chest. His legs were shaky, his body still recovering from the brutal treatment, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't slow down. The fear that had taken root in him earlier was no longer just fear. It was a hunger, a gnawing desperation that clawed at him from the inside. There was no safety, no refuge, only the relentless need to escape, to keep running, to fight back. The night air was thick, suffocating, and the city around him was silent, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren wailing in the distance. Malik's thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning in endless loops as he tried to process what had just happened. His body ached, his mind screamed for clarity, but all he could hear was the taunting voice of the officer, the cruel words that had been hurled at him. Just like the rest of your kind, huh? The words pierced through him like a blade, cutting deeper than the physical pain. He wasn't just black. He wasn't just a teenager with a disability. To them, he was nothing more than a problem, a threat to be managed, contained, silenced. Malik had spent his whole life trying to avoid moments like this, trying to stay out of the way, trying to blend in, trying to be invisible. But no matter how hard he tried, it was never enough. Every step he took, every choice he made, seemed to lead him further into their sights. And now, after everything that had happened, after everything they had done to him, he realized there was no running anymore. They had made sure of that. His mind flashed back to his childhood, to his mother's voice, the only voice that had ever given him any sense of comfort or security. She had warned him about the world. She had told him that the world didn't care about him, that the world would break him if he let it. But she also told him to stand tall, to keep fighting, to never let them take his dignity. "They'll try to break you, Malik," she would say, "but you have to stand. You have to be stronger than them." But how? How could he stand when they had already broken him so many times? How could he keep fighting when the whole system seemed rigged against him? When the very air he breathed was poisoned with hate? The thought made him stop in his tracks, his breath catching in his chest. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, and the weight of it all felt like too much to bear. The last thing he wanted was to be this person, to let the hate and the anger take over. He didn't want to be consumed by it, but it was getting harder and harder to avoid. As Malik leaned against the cold brick wall of an abandoned building, trying to steady himself, his eyes caught something in the distance. A figure moving quickly, weaving through the shadows. His heart skipped a beat as he squinted into the dark. The figure was tall, with a hooded jacket that obscured most of their face, but there was something about the way they moved that made Malik instinctively tense up. His first thought was that it was another officer, but as the figure drew closer, Malik could tell this person wasn't dressed like one. This was someone else, someone who seemed just as lost as he was, someone who carried the same weight of the city's darkness. "Hey," the figure called out, their voice low and rough. "You good?" Malik froze. He didn't know what to say, didn't know who this person was or what they wanted. But there was something about their voice, something raw, something real, that made Malik hesitate. He didn't want to trust anyone, not after everything that had happened. But there was no denying that this person seemed to understand, in some unspoken way, what Malik was going through. "Yeah," Malik muttered, not sure if he was lying to the stranger or to himself. "I'm fine." The figure stepped closer, their eyes scanning Malik carefully, as if sizing him up. Then they gave a short laugh, something bitter and sharp. "Doesn't look like you're fine. You look like you've seen the worst of it. They got you too, huh?" Malik didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure how to. It was as if this person had peeled away the mask he had been wearing, the one that kept him pretending, kept him hoping that things could get better. But they didn't get better. They never got better. The stranger moved a little closer, stopping just a few feet away. "You think you're the only one they've done this to?" the figure asked, voice full of contempt. But there was something else there too, something that Malik couldn't quite place. "They've been doing this for years, and they won't stop." The words struck Malik like a blow to the chest. It was as if the stranger had reached inside him and pulled out all the anger and frustration he'd been holding in, all the pain that had built up over the years. And yet, there was something almost comforting in the way the figure spoke. It wasn't sympathy, it was something far more dangerous. It was the understanding that Malik wasn't alone, that this wasn't just happening to him, it was happening to everyone. "They'll try to break you," the figure continued, taking a step back, their eyes narrowing as they watched Malik. "But the only way to survive this is to fight back, to not let them win." Malik's head spun. Fight back? How? How could he fight back against a system that was built to break him? He was just one person, just one black teenager in a world that didn't care. But the more the stranger spoke, the more Malik felt something stir inside him. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the rage that had been building up, or maybe it was the desperation that had taken root in him. But whatever it was, it felt like the beginning of something he couldn't ignore. The stranger took a long, hard look at Malik. "I'm not here to tell you what to do, but trust me, this fight, it's not over. Not yet. But it will be if you don't keep pushing, if you don't make them see you." Malik swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words settle into his chest like a heavy stone. He didn't know if he was ready for any of it, but one thing was clear. The world had tried to break him, to reduce him to nothing. But Malik wasn't ready to be nothing. Not yet. Not ever. The stranger turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows once again. "Think about it," they called over their shoulder. "The choice is yours." Malik stood still for a long moment, his body trembling from the weight of everything he had just heard. He felt small, helpless. But something had changed inside of him. He wasn't sure what it was, but the seed of defiance had been planted. And with that, Malik knew he couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. The streets felt different now. They were colder somehow, like the city itself had grown tired of pretending. Every alley, every shadow, held secrets Malik wasn't sure he was ready to uncover. He had always thought of the city as a place of possibilities, a place where, if you worked hard enough, you could carve out a space for yourself. But now, every corner he turned seemed to remind him that this world had no room for him. Not really. Not as he was. His mind churned as he walked, his feet moving almost instinctively, carrying him further into the night. He couldn't shake the image of the stranger from earlier, their words, the coldness in their eyes. The anger in their voice had been the same anger that Malik had buried deep inside himself. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something had shifted inside him. The fight the stranger spoke of? It wasn't just something to consider. It was something he had to do. He didn't know how he was going to fight it. How could he, just one person, take on a system that had been built on hatred, on fear, on centuries of oppression? But somewhere, deep down, he knew he couldn't keep running. He couldn't stay silent. He wasn't going to let them break him, not this time. Malik had heard stories of resistance, of people who had stood up, who had fought back against the powers that sought to destroy them. But he never thought he would be one of those people. He never thought it would get to this point. But now he realized he didn't have a choice. He had to be more than the label they had placed on him, more than the black teenager they saw when they looked at him, more than the person they expected to break. As he walked, his mind kept returning to that night. The way the officers had treated him, the way they had humiliated him, the way they had made him feel like an animal, the words they had said, the sneers on their faces, the cruelty in their eyes. And the worst part? The worst part was that it wasn't just those officers. It was everyone. Everywhere he went, there was the unspoken weight of their gaze on him, judging him, condemning him, making sure he stayed in his place, but he couldn't take it anymore. Malik's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He stopped dead in his tracks, every muscle in his body tensing. Was it them? The officers? He couldn't be sure, but he wasn't going to stick around to find out. He quickly glanced over his shoulder, but instead of the officers, it was a familiar face. Lena. She was walking briskly toward him, her eyes scanning the street nervously. She looked different than the last time he'd seen her. There was a hardness to her expression now, something that hadn't been there before. It was as if the city had left its mark on her too. "Malik," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "We need to talk." Malik felt his stomach drop. He hadn't seen Lena in days, and after what had happened with the officers, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face anyone, let alone someone who might be in danger because of him. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she motioned for him to follow her, leading him down a narrow street that was even darker than the one they'd just come from. Malik followed, his feet moving instinctively, but his mind racing with questions. What did Lena know that he didn't? Was she somehow involved in this madness? When they reached a small, dimly lit corner, Lena stopped and turned to face him. Her eyes were wide, almost frantic. But there was something else there too, something that made Malik uneasy. "I've been hearing things," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "People are talking about you, about what happened with the cops, about what you're going to do next." Malik felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "You're not the only one who's been watching," she said, her eyes darting around the street nervously. "They're getting ready to make an example out of you. They're watching, Malik. The system, the cops, the ones who keep everyone in check. They've noticed you, and they won't stop until they've put you back in your place." Malik felt a surge of panic, but he pushed it down. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena's eyes softened, but there was still that sharp edge in her gaze. "You have to be careful. People like us, we don't get second chances. You keep making noise, keep pushing back, and they'll silence you. Do you understand?" Malik swallowed hard. This was the reality. The world was watching, waiting for him to slip up, to make a mistake, to give them an excuse to put him back in his box. But how could he stop now? How could he turn back when everything in him was screaming for justice? "I don't have a choice," Malik said, his voice quiet but firm. "I can't keep running. I won't let them do this to me." Lena looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "It's not about you anymore, Malik," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "It's about all of us. The ones they've tried to break, the ones they've pushed to the edge. It's bigger than you now, and you have to be ready for what comes next." Malik didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to tell her that he was ready, that he could take whatever came his way. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. He wasn't sure how far he could push, how much he could endure. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He wasn't going to let them break him. Not now. Not ever. Lena seemed to sense the shift in him, and for the first time her expression softened. "We need to stick together, Malik. You're not alone in this, but you have to be smart. They're going to try to tear us apart, one by one, and if we don't stand together, they'll win." Malik nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. He had always believed that he was alone in this fight, that he was just another face in the crowd, just another statistic. But now, for the first time, he realized that he wasn't. There were others who felt the same pain, the same anger, the same sense of helplessness, and together they could do something, they could fight back. But that wasn't going to be easy. "They'll come for you, Malik," Lena said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have to be ready." Malik nodded again, his mind already racing with thoughts of what he needed to do next. The world had tried to break him. It had tried to make him feel small, insignificant, worthless. But they didn't understand. They didn't understand that he was stronger than they thought, that he wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. As Lena turned to leave, Malik stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. The city, with all its shadows and dangers, still held a sliver of hope. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And he was ready. The road ahead was long, and the fight would be harder than anything he had faced before. But Malik had made a choice, and now there was no turning back. The streets had become a battleground. Each step Malik took on the cracked, litter-strewn pavement felt heavier than the last. His body, bruised and sore, ached from the physical toll of the past few days, but it was the weight of the world around him that really wore him down. The world was watching, waiting for him to slip, for him to falter. He could feel their eyes on him, even when no one was looking. And every time he stepped into the public eye, it was as if the air grew colder, the tension grew thicker. He had spent the past few days trying to wrap his mind around everything that had happened. The officers, the leash, the humiliation, and it was like trying to piece together a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. But one thing had become abundantly clear. They weren't going to leave him alone. It wasn't just the police anymore. It wasn't just the system. It was everyone. The looks on the street, the whispers behind his back, the faces that turned away when he walked into a room. They were all complicit. They all saw him as something less, a problem, a threat, a danger to their comfortable lives. Malik didn't even recognize himself anymore. He wasn't the kid who used to laugh with his friends, who dreamed of a future where things were different. He was the kid who had been crushed under the weight of a system built to break people like him, and now it felt like there was no way out. The leash they had placed around his neck wasn't just a physical strap of leather. It was a metaphor, a chain that bound him to this world, a world that had already decided who he was and what he was worth. But he wasn't ready to accept that, not yet. His feet carried him through the streets, past the buildings he had known all his life. He passed by the familiar stores, the street corners where he'd once hung out with his friends, and now it felt like everything had changed. He didn't know if he could go back to those places, to those people. Not after everything. They'd never look at him the same way again. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up beside him. Malik's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for the knife tucked inside his jacket. But as the car rolled to a stop, he saw that it wasn't an officer. It was Lena. She was sitting in the driver's seat, her face set in a hard expression. But there was something else in her eyes, something that Malik couldn't quite place. "Get in," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." Malik hesitated for a moment, eyeing the car cautiously. He didn't know what Lena was up to, or where this was going, but he couldn't keep walking down the street, lost in his thoughts. He needed something, someone, to ground him. Without another word, he slid into the passenger seat, the door slamming shut behind him. Lena immediately drove off, not speaking for several long moments. The city rolled past the windows, but Malik didn't really see it. He was too caught up in the chaos inside his mind. "What's going on?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but filled with a tension that was hard to hide. "Why are we driving? What's happening?" Lena's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She didn't look at him as she spoke. "We don't have much time. The cops are looking for you. They've already got a description out. They're trying to make sure you don't disappear. They want you in custody, dead or alive." Malik felt a sickening chill sweep over him. His pulse quickened as the realization hit him. He wasn't just a target anymore. He was a fugitive. "They've made you a symbol," Lena continued, her voice steady but tinged with something darker. "They're going to turn this into a spectacle. They're going to use you as an example. And they won't stop until you're in their hands." "Why?" Malik asked, almost as if he couldn't believe it. "What did I do? What have I done that makes them want me gone?" Lena shot him a glance, her expression hardening. "You're black, Malik, and that's enough for them. You've got the audacity to exist in a world that wants to pretend you don't. You've got the audacity to fight back, to demand respect. And that's a crime in their eyes." Malik sat back in the seat, his mind spinning. He had known it. Deep down, he had known it all along. It wasn't just about the leash or the officers. It was about who he was, about how the world saw him, about how the world always saw him as less, and it was always going to be this way. But he wasn't ready to accept it. He wasn't ready to be their victim. Not now. Not ever. "We need to move, Malik," Lena said, her voice snapping him back to the present. "We've got one shot at this. We need to get you out of here. Far away. The city's too small. Too close. They'll catch you if we don't leave now." Malik nodded slowly. He didn't know where they were going, or what was waiting for him at the end of this road, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't stay in a place where every corner felt like a trap, where every street was another reminder of how small he was in their eyes. As Lena sped down the empty streets, Malik's mind kept racing. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't about running away or hiding. This was about something bigger, something that went beyond him. This was about justice. And that's when the anger started to build again. It wasn't just the anger of being treated like an animal. It wasn't just the anger of being humiliated. It was the anger of knowing that this wasn't just happening to him. It was happening to everyone who looked like him. Everyone who had ever been pushed to the margins of society. It wasn't just about the cops. It wasn't just about the leash. It was about the system. The system that had decided who mattered and who didn't. The system that had always been broken. Always had been. And Malik wasn't going to let it keep breaking him. He wasn't going to be another statistic. "I'm not running anymore," Malik said, his voice steady, filled with resolve. "I'm not hiding. I'm not going to let them do this to me. To us. I'm done." Lena's eyes flicked to him for a brief moment, and for the first time she seemed to soften. "You don't have to do this alone," she said quietly. "We've got a network. People who've been fighting this fight for a long time. They're ready to help you." Malik looked out the window, watching the city blur past him. It felt like a lifetime ago when he had been a normal kid, when the world hadn't felt so heavy. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the fight had always been there. He just hadn't seen it. It was all around him, hiding in plain sight. And now it was time to stand up, to fight back. Lena was right. He wasn't alone. The car sped down the dark roads, the city shrinking behind them. Malik's heart was heavy, but for the first time in a long time, there was a spark of hope burning deep inside him. He didn't know what the future held or how this was going to end, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. The line in the sand had been drawn, and Malik was ready to cross it. The road ahead was unclear. The dangers were real, and Malik knew that there were people out there. People who would stop at nothing to silence him, to make sure his voice never reached the masses. But there was something inside him now, something stronger than fear, and that, Malik knew, was enough. Malik could feel the pulse of the city beneath him, throbbing like a living, breathing thing. The lights blurred past the windows of the car, but it wasn't the lights that had his attention. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that surrounded him, pressing down on him like a weight. He could feel the eyes of the city on him, even though they weren't physically there. He could feel the judgment, the hatred, the expectation that he would fail. He had always felt it. But now, with everything he had been through, it was more palpable than ever. He looked at Lena, sitting beside him, her face set in a mask of determination that seemed so far removed from the person he had known just a few days ago. The city was changing them, breaking them both down in ways they hadn't anticipated. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear to Malik the world had been trying to destroy him his entire life, and now it was trying to destroy Lena too. They were two pieces in a game they had no part in creating, pawns in a system that saw them as expendable. The car hit a bump in the road, jarring him from his thoughts, but it didn't distract him. He had no time to waste thinking about how he had gotten here, about the past that seemed so far behind him now. He had to focus on the future, on what was coming next. The system was trying to silence him, to erase him, and he couldn't let that happen. Lena turned to him then, her voice low, almost a whisper. "We're close. We've got one shot at this. You ready?" Malik met her eyes, his jaw clenched. "I have no choice," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. He didn't know what was ahead. But he couldn't stop now. There was no going back. Not after everything that had happened. He wasn't the same person who had walked these streets a few days ago. Something had snapped inside of him. And now, the only way forward was to keep moving, to keep fighting. Lena nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe. Malik could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the steering wheel just a little too tightly. She was scared. Of course she was. They all were. But they had to be brave. There was no room for fear anymore, not if they wanted to survive. The car slowed as it approached a dilapidated building on the outskirts of the city. Malik couldn't remember the last time he had been this far out, this close to the fringes of everything he knew. The building loomed in front of them, its broken windows and crumbling facade a stark contrast to the polished, shiny world that had always looked down on him from above. This was where the real world lived, the world they didn't want anyone to see, the world of people like Malik and Lena, the ones who had been discarded and forgotten by a society that had no place for them. Lena parked the car in the shadow of the building, and for a moment, they just sat there in silence. Malik could hear his heart pounding in his ears, the steady thrum of his blood in his veins. He had made his choice. There was no going back. Lena turned to him then, her face hard, but her voice soft. We're not the only ones who've been fighting this. You know that, right? There are others who've been pushing back for years. People who've been through the same thing you're going through, who've seen the same hatred, the same injustice. They're waiting for you. Malik didn't answer right away. He couldn't find the words. Instead, he just nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He didn't know if he was ready for this, for whatever it was that Lena was leading him into. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stand by and let them break him. Not anymore. The door creaked as Lena opened it, stepping out of the car. Malik followed, his legs feeling heavy, like they were made of lead. As they walked toward the entrance of the building, the air around them seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. Malik's stomach churned with a sense of unease, but he pushed it aside. He had to be strong. He had to do this. They reached the door, and Lena knocked twice, the sound echoing in the silence. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked like he had seen far too many years of struggle and pain. His face was lined with age, but there was something in his eyes. Something that told Malik this man had been through hell and come out the other side. He wasn't afraid. Lena spoke first, her voice steady but urgent. We need to talk. We're in trouble. The man nodded, stepping aside to let them in. Come in, he said, his voice low but filled with authority. We've been waiting for you. Malik followed Lena inside, and the door closed behind them with a soft thud. The interior was dimly lit, the walls covered in maps, posters, and a dozen other signs of the rebellion that had taken root here. There were people moving in and out of the room, talking in hushed voices, their faces hardened by the same struggles Malik had faced. People who had been pushed to the edge, who had seen their lives torn apart by the same system that had nearly destroyed him. The man led them to a table in the center of the room, where a group of people sat, their eyes trained on Malik as he walked in. He could feel their gazes, sharp and calculating, as if they were measuring him, deciding if he was worthy of their time, their efforts. We've been hearing about you, one of them said, a woman with short, curly hair and a scar running down her cheek. Words spreading fast. You're not just some kid anymore. You're a symbol. Malik's stomach tightened. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked to be a symbol. But the reality was that the system had already made him one. He didn't get a choice. The eyes of the world were on him now, whether he wanted them to be or not. I didn't ask for any of this, Malik said, his voice tight with frustration. I just want to live. I just want to breathe without feeling like I'm being hunted. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Finally, the man who had opened the door spoke again. We're not just here to talk. We're here to fight. We're here to show them that we won't be silent anymore. We're here to make them see us. Lena stepped forward then, her voice filled with fire. We've been fighting in the shadows for too long, but it's time to step into the light. It's time to make them see who we really are. And we need you, Malik. We need your voice. Malik's heart raced in his chest as he looked around the room. These were people like him, people who had been pushed to the brink, who had been broken by a system that didn't care. But they had fought back, they had survived, and now they were asking him to do the same. He felt the weight of their gazes on him, the pressure building inside him until it was almost unbearable. But then, he made his choice. He wasn't going to hide anymore. He wasn't going to run, not from the cops, not from the system, and not from the world that had tried so hard to break him. "I'm in," Malik said, his voice firm, his heart steady. "Let's make them see us." The room erupted into applause, the sound filling the space and reverberating through Malik's bones. But it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the understanding, the connection. For the first time in what felt like forever, Malik wasn't alone. And that was enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win this fight. The path ahead was unclear, and the fight would be long. But Malik wasn't afraid anymore. He had made his choice, and now the real battle was just beginning. The days blurred into nights, and the nights blurred back into days. Time seemed to stretch and contract in ways Malik couldn't quite understand. He had spent his life watching the world around him, the injustices, the violence, the disdain, and he had stayed quiet, staying out of the way. But now, as the weeks passed, it felt like his world was shifting beneath him. It wasn't just his life anymore. It wasn't just his pain. It was theirs. The pain of everyone who had ever been oppressed, discarded, silenced. And for the first time in his life, Malik wasn't alone in his suffering. They had made him a symbol. He had become the face of something much bigger than himself. Something that was building, something that was rising in the darkness. It was a rebellion, yes. But it was also a fight for dignity, for survival, for the right to exist without fear. He wasn't fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been pushed to the edges of society, for everyone who had ever been told they were less. Every day, Lena and the others in the underground movement worked tirelessly to spread the message. They had a network now, people who had come from all corners of the city, from every walk of life, united by the shared goal of taking down the system that had been suffocating them for far too long. But it wasn't easy. Every day, there was the constant threat of the authorities getting closer, of the system tightening its grip. Malik's life had become one of constant movement, constant change. He had become a target, not just for the cops, but for the people who wanted to see him fail, to see him disappear. Every corner he turned, he knew there were eyes on him. Every step he took, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if the world itself was trying to swallow him whole. But even in the face of all that, something inside him was different. Something had awakened in him, and he wasn't afraid anymore. The fear that had once crippled him, that had driven him to keep his head down, to try to stay invisible, it was gone. All that remained was the fire of resistance, of defiance. And he would burn as bright as he had to, as long as it took. He wasn't alone in this. He had learned that quickly. But what he hadn't anticipated was the sheer force of the hatred that would be thrown at him, the anger that came with being a symbol of resistance, of everything the system had worked so hard to suppress. And that anger was as real as any weapon. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Malik found himself alone in a small, dimly lit room at their safe house. The walls were covered in maps, pinned with photos, scribbled notes, a chaotic but carefully constructed plan for revolution. He had been at the center of this movement for weeks now, but it still felt like a dream. He had never thought he would be part of something like this. He had never imagined that he would stand in opposition to everything he had been taught to accept. His thoughts were interrupted when Lena stepped into the room, her face drawn with exhaustion. But there was something else there, a spark, a glimmer of something that said she wasn't done. Not yet. "They're getting closer," she said, her voice low but filled with a sense of urgency. "We need to move faster. The cops are tightening their grip, and there's a bigger push coming. They won't stop until they've crushed us." Malik nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into his bones. They were close now. The movement was growing. The stakes were rising. And they were being hunted. Lena sat down across from him, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that spoke of the years of resistance, of struggle. This isn't going to be easy. The backlash is going to be severe. They won't just target you, Malik. They'll target anyone who even looks like they're with us. They'll try to tear us apart from the inside. Malik could feel his chest tighten. The people who had joined their cause, they were fighting not just for justice, but for their very lives. The system had made them enemies simply by existing. It wasn't just the police. It was the entire apparatus of the government, the media, the societal structures that had been in place for generations, all working together to maintain the status quo. They're scared, Malik said, his voice steady despite the fear that clung to him. They know we're not going away. They know that we've been pushed to the edge, and now we're standing up. They're scared of us. Lena gave a bitter laugh. Of course they're scared. They've built their entire world on our backs, on keeping us down, on keeping us in our place. And when we finally stand up and say no, when we finally demand that we matter, when we show them that we won't be silent anymore, they can't handle it. They'd rather kill us than let us have a voice. Malik clenched his fists, the weight of her words settling over him like a cloak. He knew it was true. He had seen it with his own eyes, the way they treated him, the way they treated everyone who looked like him. He had felt it all his life, the cold disregard, the constant reminder that he was worth less simply because of the color of his skin. And now that they were finally fighting back, the system wasn't just going to let it slide. They'll do whatever it takes to silence us, Malik said quietly, more to himself than to Lena. And they'll use anything to make sure we stay in our place. Lena looked at him, her eyes softening for a moment. But we can't let them win. We can't let them break us. We've come too far. Malik took a deep breath, standing up and walking toward the window. The city sprawled out before him, dark and distant, as if it were a separate world, a world where he had once belonged, and yet a world that no longer accepted him. The faces he saw on the streets, the ones who looked away when he passed by, those were the same faces that would cheer when the police cracked down on the movement, when they crushed the resistance and sent people like him back into the shadows. But not this time. Malik turned away from the window, his mind made up. We can't stop. We won't stop. Lena nodded, her expression hardening. Then it's time to take it to the next level. We've got a plan, but we need to hit them where it hurts. We need to take their power away. The plan was risky, dangerous even. It wasn't something Malik would have considered a few weeks ago, but things had changed. The system had pushed them into a corner, and now it was time to strike back. The police, the government, the media, they all depended on maintaining control, on keeping the people in line. And if they could disrupt that control, if they could shake the foundations of the system, then maybe, just maybe, they could change things. Malik didn't know how they would do it. He didn't know how it would end. But he knew one thing. They couldn't keep running. They couldn't keep hiding. If they were going to fight for their future, they had to stand tall. They had to be ready to face whatever came next. And they would. The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of the plan settled over them. They weren't just fighting for their own survival anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been forced to live in the shadows, for everyone who had been told they didn't matter. For once in his life, Malik felt like he had a purpose. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about making them see, making them understand that they weren't going anywhere, and that they wouldn't be silenced. The rebellion had begun, and there was no turning back. The night stretched on, and as Malik prepared for what was coming, he felt the fire inside him grow brighter. The fight was just beginning, and the world would never be the same again. The morning came like a slow burn, light creeping through the cracks in the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. The faint hum of traffic outside was a reminder that the world kept turning, oblivious to the storm that was brewing within it. Malik sat in the small, dimly lit room, staring out at the city that seemed so distant now, yet so close, like a reminder of everything he had fought for and against. The weight of the world was heavy on his shoulders. He had always known that the system was broken, that people like him were expendable, seen as less than human, not worth the effort it took to care. But now, as the rebellion took shape, as the movement began to spread, the fight had grown much larger than himself. It had become something he couldn't ignore, something that burned through him like wildfire. The air in the room was thick with tension. Everyone was on edge, preparing for what they knew was coming. The movement had grown too large for the authorities to ignore, and they were starting to feel the pressure. Malik had known this was inevitable. He had known that the system would push back, but nothing had prepared him for the scale of it, for the speed at which things were escalating. Lena entered the room, her face set in that same grim expression that had become all too familiar. She looked at Malik, her eyes scanning him as though trying to gauge what he was thinking. "We're almost there," she said, her voice low and serious. "The operation goes live tonight. It's all or nothing from here." Malik nodded slowly, his thoughts racing. The plan was risky, far more dangerous than anything they had done before, but it was necessary. They couldn't just sit back and wait for the system to come crashing down on them. It was time to take the fight to them. And if it cost them everything, they were willing to pay the price. Lena walked over to the table, where maps and photographs were spread out, detailing their targets. It was a list of key locations: police stations, government offices, media outlets, the heart of the system, the very institutions that had perpetuated the oppression, the racism, the hate. They were going to disrupt everything. They were going to show the world that they could no longer be ignored, that they would no longer be silenced. "Are you ready?" Lena asked, her eyes hardening as she glanced at Malik. Malik looked down at the table, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't wanted to be a leader. He hadn't asked to be the symbol of this movement. But he had been thrust into this role, whether he wanted it or not. And now, there was no turning back. The movement had grown too powerful, and the consequences of failure were too great. "I'm ready," Malik said, his voice firm. Though the words didn't feel like his own, they were a declaration, a commitment. The door to the room opened then, and the others began to filter in. They were all there, people from different walks of life, all united by the same cause, the same fight. They had come together, willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom, for a chance to finally be seen as human beings, not as threats or criminals. As Malik looked around the room, he saw the faces of those who had fought beside him. He saw Lena, her determination unwavering. He saw the woman with the scar on her cheek, the one who had always been so quiet, but who now stood taller than ever before. And there was the older man who had first welcomed Malik into this world of resistance. They were ready. They were all ready. The plan was set. There was no going back. The evening came, and with it, the heavy weight of anticipation. The streets were quiet, too quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Malik stood with Lena, his heart pounding in his chest as he surveyed the streets outside. Everything had led to this moment. The rebellion was no longer a whisper in the shadows. It was a full-throated roar, and tonight they were going to make the world listen. "They'll be watching," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we're ready." Malik nodded, his eyes scanning the darkened streets. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago he had been walking these very same streets, invisible, unnoticed, just another face in the crowd. Now, every step he took seemed to echo in the stillness. He was no longer invisible, he was a target. The night stretched on, the tension in the air palpable, and then, without warning, the signal came. Malik's pulse quickened as he grabbed his gear, his hands moving mechanically as he strapped on the equipment. He didn't have time to think. This was it. The plan was in motion. They were about to strike and there was no turning back. It happened in a blur of movement, all of it happening too fast for Malik to process. They hit the first target, an underground media station that had been spreading misinformation, propping up the government's narrative, twisting the truth to maintain control. The group moved quickly, taking the building by surprise. Malik's heart raced as he sprinted through the dark hallways, adrenaline pumping through his veins. They had planned this for weeks, down to the smallest detail. They knew where the cameras were, where the guards would be, but nothing ever went as planned. They had expected the police to respond quickly, but the scale of the retaliation was unlike anything they had imagined. Malik had barely made it to the control room when the sirens started blaring. The sound was deafening, filling the air with a sharp, shrill warning. "We've been compromised," Lena shouted into the comms. "Get out now!" But it was too late. They had underestimated the response. They had overestimated their own ability to remain unseen. Gunshots rang out in the hallway as Malik ducked behind a steel door, his heart hammering in his chest. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything went still. Time seemed to freeze, and then the chaos resumed. Officers stormed the building, shouting orders, their weapons drawn, eyes wide with rage. They were ready for blood, and they weren't going to let anyone leave. Malik pushed forward, his mind racing as he tried to find an exit. The others were still fighting, trying to hold the line, but the police were closing in. The weight of the situation bore down on him, every second feeling like a lifetime. They were running out of time. "Malik, we need to go." Lena's voice crackled through his earpiece, but he didn't respond. His mind was focused on one thing: survival. The rebellion wasn't over, but it could be if they didn't escape now. He rounded a corner, nearly colliding with one of the officers who had been sent to cut him off. The officer's eyes widened in shock for a fraction of a second before he aimed his gun at Malik. But Malik was faster. His body moved on instinct, dodging the officer's shot and disarming him in a fluid motion. He didn't hesitate. The officer fell to the ground unconscious. "Move! Move! Move!" Lena shouted again, and Malik didn't need another command. He sprinted toward the exit, his lungs burning, his feet pounding against the cold concrete floor. Outside, the sound of sirens filled the air, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The city was awake now, and there was no going back. The next few hours were a blur of movement. Malik and the others barely escaped, but the operation had shaken the system to its core. They had done more than just disrupt the media station. They had sparked something bigger than any of them could have imagined. The rebellion was no longer just a whisper, it was a fire, spreading across the city, across the country, and nothing would ever be the same. But it didn't come without a cost. As Malik caught his breath, crouched in the shadows, he could feel the weight of everything that had happened. They had struck a blow, yes, but they had also exposed themselves. The world was watching now, and they would stop at nothing to bring them down. They had taken their first step into the light, and the system was about to retaliate with everything it had. But Malik wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready for whatever came next. The rebellion was far from over. The fight had only just begun. The air had become thick with anticipation. The rebellion was no longer a spark. It had turned into an inferno, a wildfire spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. Every corner of the city seemed to be alive with it. People marching, chanting, rising up against a system that had oppressed them for far too long. The police, the government, and every force of authority that had sought to keep them silent were now scrambling, trying to put out the flames. But the more they tried to extinguish it, the bigger the fire grew. Malik stood on the rooftop of an old, crumbling building, staring out at the city below him. The world seemed quieter now, but the calm was deceiving. It was the calm before the storm. The authorities had launched their final assault on the rebellion. This would be their last chance to end it all, to crush the movement and silence those who dared to stand up. But Malik wasn't afraid, not anymore. The fear that had once paralyzed him had been replaced with something stronger: rage, determination, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had been marginalized, for every person who had been told they didn't matter. He was fighting for the ones who had been beaten down, ignored, and forgotten. He was fighting for a future where people like him could walk through the world without being judged, without being feared, without being treated like less than human. Lena stood beside him, her eyes scanning the streets below. She hadn't said much in the past few hours. The weight of everything they had done, everything they had risked, hung heavily between them. But they didn't need to speak. They both knew what was at stake. "They're coming," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. Malik nodded, his jaw set. We've come too far to back down now. They had made it this far because they had never stopped fighting, because they had refused to accept the way the world saw them. And now they would make sure the world saw them for what they truly were. Survivors, fighters, human beings, worthy of respect and dignity. As the minutes ticked by, Malik felt the weight of the moment settle into his chest. He had never imagined this life, never imagined that he would be standing here, preparing to make the final stand against a system that had tried so hard to break him. And yet, here he was. The crackling of radios broke the silence, and Malik's heart skipped a beat. The first wave was on its way. "Get ready," Lena said, her voice sharp with resolve. "We hold the line." They had gathered a small group of rebels, fighters who had been with them from the beginning. They were armed, prepared to face whatever came next. But it wasn't just the guns and the barricades that gave them strength. It was the fire that burned in their hearts, the conviction that they couldn't stop until they had brought the system to its knees. Malik took a deep breath and looked around at the faces of those who had joined him. They were all there because they believed in the cause. They had risked everything to stand up, to fight back. For the first time in his life, Malik didn't feel alone. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for, if it came to that. The first wave of soldiers arrived with the sound of marching boots. Malik didn't flinch. He wasn't going to back down now. He wasn't going to let them take away the future that he had fought for. Not without a fight. The air was thick with tension as the first line of officers appeared at the edge of the street below. The rebellion's barricades were holding, but for how long? The soldiers were armed, prepared to crush them. But the rebels weren't backing down. "We don't stop," Malik muttered under his breath. "We keep pushing. We keep fighting." A shot rang out, the first of many. The sound echoed in the air, a signal that the battle had begun. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for something bigger. It was a fight for the truth. The world seemed to slow as the chaos erupted around them. Soldiers moved in, their faces set in stone, their guns trained on the rebels who were standing firm. The streets that had once been a place of oppression were now a battleground. The screams of the fallen mixed with the sounds of gunfire, and Malik's heart hammered in his chest. But through it all, there was a quiet determination that burned within him. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had ever been treated like less. He was fighting for the generations to come, the ones who would no longer have to live in the shadows, the ones who would no longer have to fear the people who were supposed to protect them. "Move!" Lena shouted, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Get to the barricade!" Malik didn't hesitate. He ran alongside Lena, his legs carrying him through the chaos. The weight of the world felt lighter now. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about showing the world that they could never be erased. They reached the barricade, where the others were already digging in, holding their ground. The soldiers were closing in, but the rebels weren't backing down. This wasn't just a fight for power. This was a fight for dignity, a fight for equality, a fight for the right to live without fear. As the battle raged on, Malik felt something inside him stir. The fire was spreading, not just in the streets, but in his heart. He wasn't afraid. The system that had tried to break him had made a mistake. They thought they could control him. They thought they could silence him. But they had underestimated him. They had underestimated all of them. The battle continued into the night, the sound of gunfire and shouting filling the air. But Malik didn't look back. He didn't think about the odds, about the soldiers that kept advancing, about the blood that had already been spilled. He thought about the future, the world that could be, the world that he and his people would fight to create. He thought about the children who would never have to fear the streets again, the ones who would grow up in a world where they were seen, where they were valued. And for the first time, Malik knew that he had done the right thing. He had stood tall, refused to be broken. He had given everything for a future that wasn't his own, for a world that didn't exist yet, but one that could. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in his life, Malik believed that change was possible. That victory wasn't just a dream, it was within reach. The next morning, the city was different. The streets were filled with the signs of the struggle. Burned-out vehicles, broken glass, barricades scattered across the pavement. But amidst the destruction, something had shifted. The world had seen the power of the people. The rebellion wasn't over, but it had already begun to change the landscape of the future. Malik stood in the middle of the street, his hands trembling but his heart steady. He looked out at the city that had once felt so hostile, so distant. Now it was his, and it was theirs. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Malik felt the weight of hope settle in his chest. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. It was about being free. Thank you for following this story to the end. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what you just read. What did you think of the journey Malik went through? Have you ever experienced moments of racism in your own life? Your feedback is incredibly important to us, and we truly value each and every one of you for being a part of this community. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and giving us a like. It helps us reach more people with stories that matter. We appreciate you more than you know. Before you go, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. To let us know you've been with us until the end, write the phrase, "We rise together." Have a great day, and we look forward to hearing from you.